Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everybody out tonight. As most of you know, last week we started with our summer series, the study in Romans, and Dempsey kind of gave us an overview of what we'll be looking at and some of the themes in the book. Tonight we'll be picking up with our second installment of that. And before we get started, I'm going to change to my strong glasses. See, I got all the lights on. I got this light on. A lot of y'all know my history of the of lighting up here, but anyway, got to get situated. All right, so before we get started, I'd like to mention just something about the book itself and maybe my history with it over the years, and yours might be similar to that. I've sat through a lot of classes and heard a lot of sermons covering this epistle. And classes and lessons that are full of truth, of the truth. And but one of the things about it is it's a difficult book at times. And one of the things I've heard is how complicated and difficult it is. It's Paul's thesis on the gospel, some people say. And I say to that is I'm lost at the word thesis. It can be a little intimidating to get into a study of this book because it's full of such deep theological principles. But we need to understand these principles. The writer of one of the books I've been reading, because I've tried to take a very simple approach to just the way I've studied it, and I've kind of picked that up in our Psalm study. I'll read something over and over again and look for repetition and themes. And so I've tried to pick up on that in this study. And one of the writers of a book that I'd read a little bit of, he made the point about Romans. He said, it isn't a dissertation. And even before it was a book in the Bible, it was a letter sent from an apostle to a group of Christians. A group of Christians, Jews and Greeks or Gentiles, as it's referred to, who Paul believed needed a better understanding of the gospel, a better appreciation for what God had done for them through the gospel, and then how the gospel would transform them into godly, righteous people. And so I've tried to keep that in mind, that simplicity in mind as I've studied and in the way that I've prepared my thoughts for tonight. And it's hard to start without going back and rereading chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. So if you're in Romans 1, go ahead and let's look again at 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. The gospel, or the good news, is the power of God for salvation, as he says. It's only good news if you realize that you need saving. If you don't realize you need saving, then it means nothing to you. It's just another story. You're indifferent and you really don't care about the gospel. So it doesn't matter to you. And so Paul starts there, really. He makes it matter to the people. And so tonight, if you flip your page over there to Romans 3 and verse 9, because this is where we're headed. Romans 3:9. What then? Are we better than they? No, or not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. That's where we're going. Everyone needs the gospel because we're under sin. So there's no big reveal at the end. That's where we're headed. Everyone's under sin. And so Paul starts, we're going to go from chapter 1, 18 through maybe around chapter 3, verse 20, hopefully. Got a lot of ground to cover. And since we have so much, we're not going to be diving deep into things. We're going to try to take a good overview. So he starts in chapter 1, goes through 3 and verse 20, and he builds a case against the Jews and the Gentiles. And the way I see it, he lays them bare and indicts them as sinners, every last one of them. So that's where we're headed. And everyone needs salvation from God. And he starts to build that case in chapter 1 and verse 18. let's see. And he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." The Gentiles need saving because of the wrath of God. It's the ungodliness or behavior not resembling God, and it's unrighteousness versus the righteousness that we see back in verse 17 of the righteousness of God. Here, the unrighteousness of men, they would be not living by faith in a way that they showed no trust in God. So they need saving because of the wrath of God. And we see there's two reasons why in the next several verses. The first reason is that they suppress the truth about God. Let's look at 18 through, I think, around 21. We'll continue reading 18. So the wrath is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things he has made. So they are without excuse. So what we see is they suppress the truth about God, a truth that he says is plain to them, and that's because he has shown it to them. Those invisible attributes are clearly seen in specifically his eternal power and his divine nature. They're clearly seen through creation, is what I believe is what he says here. And so what Paul is saying is there's a kind of revelation from God that is found in the natural order of creation. You may think back to Psalm 19, verse 2, where he says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." So the heavens, they declare God's glory. The sky proclaims his handiwork, and day and night knowledge is revealed. So there is a kind of revelation from God in natural order. And really, if you think about the way Paul approached some of those churches when he did his preaching trips in Acts, he said very similar things, that the creation was evidence of who God was and what he had done. So the point is, God has revealed himself in creation. Even though the Gentiles didn't have the law and the covenant relationship and know God the way that the Jews did, there was enough evidence of creation for them to know or see those invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature, the two things that should lead them to worship and honor him. So knowing God and who he is and how to respond to him, that is the truth that they suppressed. And so, as he says there, as a result, they are without excuse. They have no way to justify their actions. We all know what an excuse is, I think. I'm sure we've all made one at some point in time. Something I read, this excuse or excused is kind of a legal term. And so we're kind of in a legal setting. He's indicting them for sin. We're going to see later God's a judge. But at the end of a trial, let's say it's a criminal trial, the guy that's on trial, after it's all over, he either gets punished or gets a sentence, or he gets released. And that's what this excused term is kind of referring to this release from a criminal trial, so to speak. So they are without excuse. They have no way, there's going to be no release for them. The second reason that we see that they need God's saving grace is, with all the evidence that they had, they didn't respond properly. Or so why, this is why they are under the wrath, I guess. Look at verses 21 through 23. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." So they didn't respond to him properly. They didn't worship him or give thanks to him. They didn't honor him. And it's not for a lack of knowledge, as he's already said, and ignorance isn't the reason. they had what I would classify as a thinking problem. They became futile in their thinking, as he says in verse 21. And they suppressed the truth about God, and then they replaced it with their own version of truth and their own thinking. And so all this leads to what he describes here as an exchange. 3 times in these next few verses, he's going to use this. He's going to say they exchanged, which we all understand what exchanging is. We get a Christmas present, we don't like it, we take it back and we exchange it something for comparable, usually even. But what they do, they exchange or replace God with something inferior. And so that's not an even exchange. They're giving up something great for something lesser. They take the glory of the immortal God and replace it for images of mortal man, birds and animals, creeping things. This is, again, an unequal exchange. So and if you think about it, this is what the Jews did, even though we're talking about the Gentiles. The Jews did this at Sinai. Moses was up on the mountain, and they took the golden calf, and they replaced God with the golden calf. And throughout the history, going back a long way to the Old Testament, the Gentiles' idolatry was a huge problem. I think we've all seen that when we read through the Old Testament. So God's wrath is revealed because the Gentiles suppressed the truth about God and refused to honor him. So in verses 24 through 32, Paul explains exactly how this wrath is revealed. Let's read, let's see. We'll start in verse 24. And notice, there's a phrase here, another phrase that he uses 3 times, God gave them up. So we'll have that first one of those phrases here. Let's look at 24. We'll start reading there. If I can get my iPad. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So in this, we see that God gave them up to what I think would be impurity, or we could call that sexual immorality in verse 24. This was a huge problem for the Gentiles, and it was closely associated with idolatry. They went hand in hand. And sadly, this was also a huge problem for Israel when you read through the Old Testament. Idolatry, sexual immorality played a huge part in Judah's downfall, and Israel, for that matter. And by this time, they've seemed to have kicked that habit and have other issues. But we can't, overlook the fact that it was a problem, sexual immorality for the Jews. But the Gentiles going down this road of sexual immorality is a form of judgment from God, a revealing of his wrath. And that's not something I've ever thought of, really, I don't think, in this way. I just think it's man pursuing sin. But this says that this is part of God's wrath, God allowing them to go down this road. Almost like he's taken off the guardrails and let them go, so to speak. Now, this is a form of judgment. There will be another judgment, a more permanent judgment in the future. But in the immediate sense, God is letting them pursue sin, and that is a form of judgment from him. And also we see that this is a result of a second exchange in verse 25. It says, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. They exchanged the truth about God for and this goes back to their futile thinking. They exchanged the truth that God is Creator. And so when you think about God being the Creator, it means that there's structure. There's order in every part of creation. What does it say in Genesis, in the creation account, at the end of those days? It was good. There's order in God's creation, and it's structured. And he created male and female, husband and wife, and the marriage relationship. And that's where the sexual relationship belonged, or still belongs, not in idol worship as they had put it in. And so when you exchange that truth, you reject the inherent structure of God's creation, And once you've done that, you feel free to replace it with anything that your heart desires. And that's what the Gentiles did, which leads into verses 26 and 7. He gave them up to dishonorable passion. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those who are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. So they replaced it with these dishonorable passions, and not just sexual immorality, but in this instance, homosexuality. Women and men, they exchanged what was natural, the relations that followed the structure of God's creation, and they replaced it with relations that went against God's orderly structure in his creation, homosexuality. And that leads us into the next thing that he gave them up to, a debased mind. Let's look at verses 28 through 32. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetous, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. A debased mind. And really what we see in this is just a downward spiral, I think. It goes from bad to worse, their condition. A debased mind, morally reprehensible, depraved, worthless minds, thinking and focusing on ungodly, unrighteous things. And this, again, reminds me, in the Old Testament of the time of the flood. There's similar language there about what the people, how they were. You think about Sodom and Gomorrah when God judged them. And then again, to pick on the Jews a little bit, think about the end of the book of Judges. Some of the language that's used to describe the way the judges were and just how awful the people have become. So a debased mind, this isn't just bad judgment or bad thinking. This is a point where people's consciences are seared. They ignore the truth about God, which leads them down a road of depravity and unrighteousness. They don't just go down the road, they embrace it. And even though they know that, as he says, those who practice such things deserve to die, there in verse 32. They know all this. And this is where God allows them to go because of their sin. And to sum it up against the case against the Gentiles, I think you could say the Gentiles gave up on God and God gave up on the Gentiles. And that's why they need God's saving grace through the gospel. Now, it's almost like Paul can envision how everybody's reacting to this letter as he's writing it to them. Because in chapter 2, in chapter 2, verse 17, he kind of starts into the Jews directly. But in 1 through 16, he takes a small detour. And like I said, it's almost like he knows how they're going to react to what he's saying. There's probably going to be people looking around the room and saying, I don't think he's only taken, what did I say? People looking around with some judgment, especially the Jews. And I don't think he's only taking out the Jews here, but he's leaning pretty hard on them. He does this by everyone who judges, or he says in verse 1 of chapter 2. Anyone who would look at a fellow Christian and say, those people have done some horrible things. And I'm glad I'm better than them. And you could almost think people would be sitting there looking like, those people are awful. I can't believe that they did all those things. And so he's going to address that type of mentality here in these verses. So let's look at verse 1 of chapter 2. Therefore, he says, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself. Paul says these judges have no excuse, just like he said that those Gentiles had no excuse. There was going to be no way for them to be released at the end of the trial, so to speak. that there's nothing they could say that could justify themselves, because they are guilty of, what does he say? The same things. What things? Pretend just for a second that it doesn't say chapter 2 there, and look back to, I think it's verse 32. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. The things that he's talking about that they're guilty of are the same things that made the Gentiles guilty. So whoever these judges are, they put themselves in a place to judge. So we see that they're kind of self-righteous in a way. And they're also unqualified, as I would see it, because of their guilt. They're guilty of the same things. So I think in these first 16 verses, Paul establishes two important things. The first and foremost, God's judgment is right and impartial. And we see that in verses 2, 6, and 11. And then, and you consider that, the judges that he's addressing, they were neither one of those things, or right or impartial. And then the other thing that he establishes, I believe, is that no one will escape God's judgment, no matter who they are. And that fact is important, since he's just said that these judges do the same thing that these other people he's described as being guilty. So they deserve the same punishment that he describes in verse 32, which is death. So he does one of the things that he, in the next few verses that he does frequently in some of the epistles. He asks questions that make you think, or maybe questions he knows that other people are already wanting to ask. Let's look at verses 3 through 5 of chapter 2. Well, we'll start in verse 2. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Again, referring back to those sins that the Gentiles had done. Do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But because of your hard and penitent heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself on the day when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He says your self-righteousness won't help you escape judgment. And God's patience isn't some kind of approval that you might think because he's being patient. It's meant to give you time to turn to him. And there will be a time when God's patience runs out. The day of wrath when you will experience God's righteous judgment. And this will be more than just the way that the Gentiles had experienced it. This will be more of a permanent judgment, I feel, is what he's referring to there. So he says, don't ignore about the truth of your own sins. You think you're exempt, but you're storing up wrath for yourself. And to use some of the imagery from the Old Testament, that bowl full of wrath will eventually be full, and God will pour it out on you. You cannot escape God's judgment. In the next few verses, we see him speaking more to the fact that God's judgment is impartial. Verse 6 through 11. He will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. God will render to each one according to his works. People sometimes, I think, misuse this statement to say Paul's teaching the salvation by works doctrine, so to speak. And I don't think that could be any further from the truth, based on what he says later in chapter 3 and then chapter 4 about salvation by grace through faith. And we won't go any deeper into that, but I'm just going to say come back in the next couple weeks and you'll get some good preaching on that, because next week Wayne Galloway will be here. So we'll definitely get some good information next week on chapter 3 and maybe some of 4. What I think this does when it makes this statement, God will render to each one according to his works, it specifically speaks to and emphasizes God's impartiality. Reward or punishment will be given out based on the same standard, no matter who you are, Jew or Gentile. Faithfulness or unfaithfulness to God is the standard. And the way I see this is man chooses salvation or punishment himself based on what he seeks and does, based on some of those words that we just read. You seek glory and honor, and you act in a well-doing, obedient manner, you'll receive life, glory, and honor. But if you're self-seeking, you do not obey the truth, you obey unrighteousness, you do evil, you will receive wrath, fury, tribulation, and distress. So the works serve as evidence for God to evaluate each man in making his judgment. And I think this applies to everyone, Jews and Greeks. All men will be judged the same, regardless of which law someone may be under. Let's see, have we read that? Let's look at 12 through, I think, maybe 16 of chapter 2. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. So regardless of which law someone's under, they're going to be judged. Those, as he described, as without the law, and I think he's talking about the law of Moses here, because he's making this contrast here of the Jews and the Gentiles. So the Gentiles would be the ones without the law. And even though they were not under the law of Moses, they had a responsibility to live to a moral standard that was set at creation. And they failed at that. And that was his whole point in chapter 1. But also, those who are under the law, the Jews, they're going to be judged, both of them are. The ones who will be justified or vindicated or excused are the ones who love the law, have it written on their hearts, and do it in faith because they know that it's right. That's how God will judge the secrets of men, as he says, by Christ. So in this illustration of judges and this discussion of God's impartial judgment, Paul is trying to bring them to the reality that everyone will be judged equally. Because God is impartial, that means Jews need God's saving grace too, just as much as the Gentiles. They need the gospel. And so beginning in chapter 2, verse 17 through really even into chapter 3, Paul starts to prove their need for the gospel and what I've described as deconstructing who they saw as themselves as and the things that they boast in. Let's look at verses 17 and 18. First, we'll look at 17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. So these are things that they would identify themselves as. A Jew, a descendant of Abraham, one of God's covenant people. They relied on the law. And the law, if you think about it, the law of Moses is really what separated the Jews and the Gentiles. And with circumcision, with all their food laws and their sacrifices, the holy days, it was the law that set them apart. Because so much of the things outside of those special things for the Jewish people are the things that the Gentiles were supposed to be observing anyway. So it's the law of Moses. They relied on it. They boasted in God because they had a relationship with him. The Gentiles, they'd exchanged God for idols. He says they know his will, and that's because they have the law. They approve what is excellent. Because they've been taught from the law, they can determine what's right and wrong and how to please God. So they see themselves as these special people because of this special relationship they have with God. And then in verse 18, or I guess it's maybe verse 19, I see these things as claims of superiority, things that the Jews looked at themselves and saw themselves as superior to other people, the Gentiles. Let's look at verses 19 and 20. And if you are sure that you yourselves are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, and an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. So things that they see themselves are claims of superiority. They see themselves as guides to the blind. And so when you see yourself as a guide to the blind, that means that you think that you can see even though other people can't. And so you have a little bit of a superiority complex, and that you can help them in their blindness, so to speak, but you can guide them. And specifically here, the Gentiles in chapter 1 verse 20 were blind to God's eternal power and divine nature. They see themselves as a light to those in darkness, and that's similar to a guide to the blind. Israel's supposed to be the light to the world. They see themselves and take pride in the fact that they are an instructor to the foolish. The Gentiles, as he describes them in chapter 1, verse 22, were foolish. A teacher of children, different than foolish, just like in human growth process, children need to be taught and brought along by someone who is wise, and they see themselves as being this person. And then having the embodiment of knowledge and truth, they think they have it all together, that they're the total package. They're like, we're Jews, we're better than everyone, we're above the law, so to speak. So Paul identifies or kind of brings up stuff that they see themselves as, maybe their superiority complex. And in verses 21 through 22, he kind of drops a hammer on them. Let's look at, or 21 through 23. You then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. Paul kind of, breaks them down here a little bit, but he says, do you teach others, but do you teach yourself? Are you listening to the things that you're saying? You preach against stealing, but are you going out and stealing? You say that one must not commit adultery, but do you commit adultery? You abhor idols, do you rob temples? You boast in the law, but you dishonor God by breaking the law. And so what I want us to notice is the hypocrisy in all these things. They felt like they were above the law, much like those people who were judging there in the first chapter, or in the first part of chapter 2, that he says has no excuse. In verse 24, he quotes Isaiah. And I realize I'll probably run out of time, but that's okay. He quotes Isaiah in verse 24. For it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among you, among the Gentiles, is blasphemed among you, among the Gentiles because of you. Sorry about that. He's making the point that part of the reason the Gentiles have turned from God is that the Jews, God's chosen people, they haven't represented God in the way they should. And these kind of Jews weren't really God's covenant people. Verses 25 through 29, I think what we see in those is he talks about what it means to be a real Jew, is what I would call it, one of God's covenant people. And it kind of reminds me of the discussion he has over in Galatians, where he talks about who are the true descendants of Abraham. So 25 through 29. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Paul brings up something that the Jews saw as extremely valuable, and that is circumcision. It was a sign of the covenant with God. It was what distinguished them from the rest of the world. And his point is that the value and the distinction that they've associated with circumcision only exists when you keep the law or you're committed to the covenant. For all of us who are married, we probably went through a marriage ceremony and made some vows, and then we exchanged some rings. And those rings, what do they represent? Your commitment to those vows and the covenant that you made with your spouse. But when you go out as a spouse and you break those vows, then really this ring on your finger doesn't mean anything. It's just another silly thing, trinket that you have on your finger. So the importance is on keeping the covenant in your vows, I think is what he's saying. Circumcision or commitment to the covenant becomes worthless, and it doesn't even exist when you break the law. On the other hand, and this is where it gets kind of interesting for the Gentiles and the Jews, when uncircumcised Gentile keeps the law, his uncircumcision is regarded as circumcision. And not only that, he condemns the uncircumcised Jew who doesn't keep the law. A true Jew, being one of God's covenant people, isn't about external things, but it's about who you are on the inside, in your heart. And if you think about, we won't turn back there, Deuteronomy 10, Jeremiah 4:4, this was the way that it was really supposed to be all along for the Jews. And they had forgotten this. And we talked about David a little bit in our class on Sunday. Just barely got into him. And what's one of the most well-known phrases about David? He was a man after God's own heart. The heart is where it's at for God. And those are the true covenant people who have the law in their heart. So can you imagine how the Jews reacted to this? Think about that for a second. We're in this congregation, the letter's being written. There's a little indignation maybe, a little frustration. Their identity and self-worth were tied to the law and being a Jew. And so this kind of like just shakes their whole world to the foundation, turns it upside down. And so almost as if he can anticipate the questions or the way they're going to react, Paul goes into chapter 3 with some questions. Because they're probably thinking, then what was the whole point of the law? What we've been doing this whole time, serving God the way we have been. He says, look at chapter 3, verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? If we deserve the wrath of God's wrath, just like these Gentile sinners, then what's been the whole point of trying to be Jews? That's kind of like what these questions kind of indicate. And so I guess question would be, did the Jews have an advantage by being part of the Jewish system? And Paul's answer has been very advantageous. He says, you were entrusted with God's word. He says, much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with God, with the oracles of God. So they've been entrusted with God's word. They knew firsthand about things like God's grace, his mercy. They knew about the promises of salvation through the Messiah. They basically knew the gospel message. They had a covenant relationship with God. So these are the huge advantages that the Jews had over the Gentiles. And the problem is they didn't take advantage of what they were given. Some were unfaithful. Verse 3, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. If our sinning proves God's righteousness, is he really right to punish us at all? Is basically what that question is. Shouldn't he just take it easy on us? And Paul says, by no means. That's not how it works. God's judgment is impartial. You, because you're Jews, can't escape judgment. He won't overlook anyone. So in the last couple of verses here that that we'll probably have time to cover. Maybe 5, 7, and 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? And it's almost like he's embarrassed to even bring it up. He says, I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? So to me, these questions show a level of desperation from the Jews. It's like they're grasping at anything that they could do to excuse or justify themselves. And Paul's point is, no, you will be judged, and your punishment is just. Which leads us to where we kind of started, verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. And then, I don't think we'll have time to read these verses. Just look at these verses. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for good. All have turned. Do you see the all-encompassing language used here? Everyone will be judged. And then in verses 13 through 17, their throat is an open grave. And so these are all pulled from mostly the Psalms and some of the prophets, these phrases that are quoted here. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So do you notice anything in those verses? Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you instead of trying to lead you to it. The body parts. They're rotten from head to toe. Their throat, their tongues, their feet. They're sinners from top to bottom. That's the point. All people are sinners, and all people need the gospel, salvation through Jesus Christ. So I think we're out of time, and we're basically at the end of the part that we're going to cover tonight. So I appreciate everyone's kind attention, not throwing anything after me. I hear there's a tomato shortage, so you didn't have any tomatoes because there was bad rain and some freezing temperatures, in Florida back in the winter. But anyway, so I'll have a few more things to say here at the invitation. So thank you all. So we did cover a lot of material, and I was really fast, and I didn't get a chance to make any applications, really. And as Dad mentioned, it's not the most pleasant part of the book. There's a lot of negativity. And as I was thinking, I was like, what can I say to leave everybody with some hope? And that's what I was wanting to go with my invitation. But I decided to double down on the negativity. So, here goes. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that Romans isn't just a dissertation. It's a letter from an apostle to a group of Christians who needed a better understanding of the gospel, a better appreciation for what God had done for them through the gospel, and then how that gospel would transform them into godly, righteous people. Here we are all these years later studying the same letter, and probably not for the first time for most of us. The circumstances are different. We're not coming back from being banished to worship together. We did go through COVID, but that was just a short time period. But some things haven't changed. We need a better understanding of the gospel, a better appreciation for what God has done for us through the gospel, and to know that the gospel will transform us into godly people. Because we're just like those people that Paul indicted in what we just read. And God's still the same impartial judge that he was then. One parallel I'd like to draw is something kind of the way he talked to the Jews. And I'm just going to put it like this. It doesn't matter how long you've been a Christian, if you grew up going to church, if 10 generations of your family were Christians, or if you come and are baptized tonight. We're all going to be judged the same. Judged by the way we trust and obey God and do His will. There's not going to be any silly loopholes as Paul is trying to put to bed with the Jews there in chapter 3. The bottom line is we deserve God's wrath. Until we fully grasp that fact, that we deserve His wrath because we're sinners. I'm a sinner. We're never going to appreciate the gospel. The power of God for salvation. Really understanding those two things is a good starting point if you're not a Christian. You got to know that you're a sinner and that you need God. He's the only source of salvation. So regardless of your circumstance, if you need to be baptized tonight, if you're a Christian and you need to pray for forgiveness, we ask that you would come as we stand and sing.